Hello, everyone, and welcome to SmartBear Academy ServiceV 201. I am live in the SmartBear studio with Mike and Gail to get started with the 201 class. So we're going to dive right in. If somebody, some of our customers out in the audience attending, if you could just let us know in the question chat box that you could hear us okay. We would appreciate it, or if you have any audio troubles, let us know. So I'm just going to go through a couple housekeeping items before we get started with the training. And this class is being recorded. We are going a little bit of a different route now with the recordings, that you will automatically tomorrow receive a recording from the GoToWebinar link. So it's not going to come from customers at smartbear.com. You will receive the recording directly from GoToWebinar, and you'll receive that 24 hours after today's class. So keep an eye out for that. If you do not get it, feel free to email us at customers@smartbear.com to receive it. And we'd love to make this class as interactive as possible, so ask as many questions as possible. Both Mike and Gail will be taking periodic stops and be able to ask some questions as they go through the class. And this is part of the quarterly advanced classes. We will be also having a Load UI class, and then we'll be starting up our Ready API monthly class next month in September. If you're looking for any advanced training as well, once you've gone through some of the free training classes, we do have one of our training partners, Wise Clouds, has some different on-site and remote classes. Feel free to reach out to your account manager or customer success manager to find out some more details on that. And some exciting news too for you. We'd love to have our customers join us for our first ever SmartBear conference. It's September 12th to the 13th. And the first day we'll have interactive product training classes. Mike Giller, who's here in the room with me now, will actually be running the 7 sessions on day 1, so we're excited to have him.
With some help from my team.
But yeah,
yes. Definitely.
Yes.
7 sessions.
Yeah.
Wow.
We'll be
Good for you.
speaking for 8 hours straight now. So he will be there, so you'll be able to meet him in person. There's the welcome party after day 1 training. You'll get your certificates. You'll be able to interact with the SmartBear team. There's different check your knowledge questions throughout the day, so it'll be a really great day, and the only time that you'll be able to get this type of content and one-on-one live training will be at this yearly conference. Day 2 will have different speakers from industry experts, SmartBear customers, so there is still some tickets available. I will put the link for more information on it, and reach out to your SmartBear contact too if you have any additional questions, but we look forward to seeing you all there. And without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Mike, who is going to get started with Gail on the training.
Great, thank you, Dana. So nice to see you in the room here with us. Yeah, so welcome everyone. So glad you could join us and take time out of your day. I know everybody's overly busy always. Hopefully you'll learn a lot and you can take advantage of what you're going to learn and you can use it in your next project, because we think there's some great stuff here. So Mike and I are going to go through ServiceV 201, which is mostly focused on creating Virts and creating Virts in all different ways. And then the next session, which is a 202 session, which is in a couple weeks, we'll cover more about the Virt server, more tips and tricks and stuff like that. So without further ado, unless Mike, do you have anything to add?
Should we go through the surveys?
The surveys. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. The poll, sorry.
The poll.
Right. We're going to do a poll. So we'd love to get some information more about you guys, or a little bit more about you guys. So let's do 2 quick polls. The first one is, how do you expect that you're going to be virtualizing your APIs? Like, there's so many different things that you can, so many different reasons that you would decide to virtualize APIs, and we're really curious to understand what is driving you to consider virtualization. And do you want to step out any dependencies that you have? Are you looking to prototype APIs while you're developing them? Are you looking for creating some scenarios that make it easier to test edge cases and, you know, maxes and mins and sort of odd situations? Or do you have anything else that you're using it for? And you can pick as many as makes sense, but we're really curious about sort of what drives you. We think we know what drives most people in the SOAP world, the SOAP UI world,
Right.
but in fact, we find that ServiceV appeals to customers who are not at all SOAP UI users. And that's actually one of the sort of interesting things is that people aren't using virtualization, certainly and ServiceV, only to virtualize for testing. There's lots of other reasons. We have great application development stories and stuff like that. So please do select your answers. And
Sharing the results.
the results are up there. So, okay, prototyping, testing scenarios, as well as stepping dependencies. I want to dig into that other, but I guess we can't do that here.
Yeah, and
If you want to put anything in the chat, yeah.
Right. Please, for other, if it's very widely different, please do share that in the chat because we love this kind of information. So please share, up to SmartBear.
Yeah, that would be great. Perfect. So the next one is just a little bit about you guys and what you use of our products. We don't need to be forcing you to use any of the products, but we find it interesting, like I said before, what products out of the portfolio are you guys using? So if you're using ServiceV and or Virt Server, SoapUI Pro or LoadUI Pro, we'd love to know it. Also, it helps us to direct our conversations into what makes most sense. So please select all that apply for which scenarios you're using. Alrighty. So, results. Everybody's using SoapUI. Aha. And some of you are using ServiceV and some of you are using Load. Okay, perfect. That's not particularly surprising, but that's great to see. That's helps us segment it for sure. Okay. So without further ado, let's take a quick look at the agenda. And like I said, we're going to cover today mostly around creating virtualized services, and we try to refer to them as virtualized services these days because we do more than just APIs. We now support JDBC. So REST, SOAP, JMS, and JDBC. So you can create virtualized services for any of those. And we're going to talk about how do you set them up using those 3 use cases that we talked about, reducing external costs, removing dependencies between teams, or controlling those API conditions for testing. So we're going to talk about how you can set up virtualized services in different ways, and we're just using these scenarios to drive those models. And we'll also go through a bunch of samples and scenarios as well. And then, like I said, the next session, which is not on August 30th, we have to check and see when it is. We'll tell you. Oh, it is on August 30th. I always think we're not in August. On August 30th, the 301 session, which will be more focused on Virt Server, which is the tool that we use to share virtualized services across your team members. So you can have a couple people creating them and other people using them. So, alrighty. So just like to sort of reiterate this, and maybe it's obvious, but we find that there is some people that it's not quite been clear. And it's not because of you guys, it's because we're actually not very clear about it. In fact, if you look on our website, it's very hard to find Virt Server. And we're going to fix that, I think, in the next couple of weeks. It's in our next sprint. So we're going to update the website. But in general, ServiceV is that graphical interface that lets you create Virts by point and click. And Mike's going to show you that. It's really, really easy to use. You can also do scripting if you want to, but out of the box you can create the most pretty complex environment scenarios with just the UI. And users just download ServiceV to their desktop. It's part of the Ready API suite of products. So when you download Ready API, it comes with it. And the Virt Server is a product that runs on a server, and it allows team members to access or share or use virtualized services that have been created already. So you create them using ServiceV, and then you can push them out to the Virt Server, and once they're out on the Virt Server, other people on the team can access it and use them. And it makes it really easy to share. It makes it really easy to segment the smart guys who are creating Virts and who have that expertise from the people who just need to use the Virts in their day-to-day jobs. So it allows you to really focus on what expertise you have with each user and just use what's important to them. So a little bit about how it works. So basically, I am sitting at my computer, and I want to talk to an API. That's what that is over there. But the API isn't there. So sometimes the API isn't there.
Or it's just tough to control. It changes all the time. It's up, 2 hours out of a day.
Right, exactly. Developers are working on it, or it's expensive. You're accessing a public API.
Exactly,
right. So basically, you normally would be accessing the API directly, but instead it's not available. And then, so what you do is you would create a connection through ServiceV to the real API, and you'd go ahead and you'd get recording of that API. This is one of the ways you can do it. We're going to show you a couple of different ways. You get recordings of the interactions, and it would be captured in ServiceV. So you're creating a Virt, a virtualized instance of that service, and now what you can do is you no longer connect up to the real API. You can do all of your testing or interaction directly through ServiceV or through the virtualized service, either running on ServiceV or on the Virt server, and you no longer have to access that API at all. So the real one is no longer a dependency, and now you have created this virtualized service by just recording or creating it manually, and you're running it separately from the real API. So that's basically how it works.
Yeah, and just to add, one exciting thing that I kind of found during the implementation of this and the rollout of this is, so this, if this diagram doesn't make sense yet, just bear with us. We'll get into the actual in-product stuff. It'll make more sense, but this kind of dynamic routing of accessing the mock versus an API can be very granular. So this diagram talks about switching through an API, but it's even more granular than that. So for example, you can keep using the API, but then with this layer you can virtualize an API operation that didn't exist yet, right? Or one of the operations can give you a negative result that you can control, but all the other ones can give you real results. Yeah. So you'll see how it gets even more granular. So it's not just,
it's not on or off.
Right.
It's actually when you want it to be available or not. So it's actually, like Mike said, so basically you can be very specific about when you want a virtualized response or when you want to get a response from the API, from the real API.
Exactly.
And it's really nice because it's actually very easy to configure that. It's very dynamic, and so it allows you to switch between the real responses and the virtualized responses as needed. Yep. So the first scenario that Mike's going to walk through is reducing external costs, and then Mike's going to show you it. But basically, we see a lot of our customers are interacting with services that are out there, either on the internet or even sometimes they're costs that are associated with internal APIs. But basically, you're getting charged for every access. And if you're doing a lot of testing, if you're doing performance work, if you're doing all sorts of things like that, you can imagine really quickly meeting your financial, exceeding your financial expectations of what the testing is going to cost you. And so this virtualizing API would allow you to not have any service charges whatsoever, have no limitations on it. And the other thing that happens is not only do they charge you, but these other APIs often have throttling. You can't count on it being there. It might not be accessible when you need it to be. As Mike said, it could be, only available for a couple hours a day. So this allows you to really do whatever you need to do and never be dependent on being limited by its availability. So it's always available to you. You don't have to worry about throttling and getting slower response. I used to work in the SharePoint world. I was a SharePoint ISV, and the public SharePoint in the cloud absolutely throttled. As you started hitting it more, it throttled and slowed it down. So it was very, very difficult to do testing against it. So this makes it really, really easy to do that.
Yeah.
In fact, I wish I had known about virtualization of APIs then.
I know, same here. I mean, this is a common approach. I know, in the poll that we've taken conducted just a couple of minutes ago, this wasn't the most common scenario, but I think you'll you'll see this come up a lot now that you kind of see this in action. But anytime the API, is not developed, or anytime there's an issue. So I worked in e-commerce as well prior to my SmartBear life, right? And in my dev environment in e-commerce, I could never do a checkout because I was never going to put my cart down to check a widget in my dev environment. So
Right, exactly.
I could never do that.
Test, right? You were limited, right?
Right. So I'm like, I think it works. Let's push it out.
Good
And
enough.
if it doesn't, they'll definitely let me know. I didn't need to do that if I had this kind of solution.
Right.
So again, now that you know about the scenario, I think you'll see the applications are more frequent than you believe.
And we have a customer story, and one of our big customers that's using it in the financial industries, and they do. This is to me just a perfect example. They have a training application that they built, and because it's the financial services, basically they're connecting up to all sorts of financial systems on the back end, and each of those financial systems are highly encumbered. Either they're expensive to deploy, the hardware they need to run on expensive, or once you create a transaction, it's hard to clear it out. Because this is training. So they're creating, every week they have new people that they're training on this application that they built internally. And what they did was they virtualized all of those expensive APIs, whether it, for lots of different reasons, they are expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And
financial APIs are expensive. Any financial data.
Right, exactly. And well, even the resetting of them is expensive, right? So even if you had to reset your systems because, you want to take out those transactions, so because they're not real. So anyway, it's a great example of a scenario. And this is just to drive it home, basically showing you the flow. User develops ServiceV to create a local Virt, and we're going to say the word Virt too often, but that's how we refer to these simulated responses.
I know.
Or mocks, or
mocks, stubs, fakes.
Right.
The industry hasn't quite settled, but if you hear those, like I said, mocks, stubs, fakes, references, and we say Virt, just kind of
translate that quick.
Right.
And so the developer can then test the code against the Virt, and then the Virt is as exact to the responses that you need, and virtualized APIs or virtualized services can all use data-driven stuff, so you can use external files to simulate lots and lots of content, lots of different responses and stuff like that.
All right, so let me show kind of how this translates to the product and how this is something that you would set up within ServiceV. So if you've attended previous sessions within Ready API, at some point I'm sure we've covered. One sec. Having some weird screen sharing thing. There we go. So at some point you must have seen, us talk about functional testing, security testing, load testing. And all those three products allow us to test some API that's somewhere, internal, external, somewhere that's accessible, right? With ServiceV, to Gail's point, we see that a lot of people use ServiceV to create APIs that might not even be using SOAP UI. So again, I from polling the audience, we understand that you all have usage and some knowledge of SOAP UI, but if you have colleagues who are, say, front-end developers, right, that's a common use case where they can benefit from having access to changing the backend through ServiceV.
Right. And that's a good point, because one of the things I wanted to do is sort of say, you guys are all SOAP users, and maybe that's what's driving you to think about virtualization as part of your testing. But think about maybe other parts of your organization where it might be beneficial to virtualize, and they hadn't even thought about it. And so that's one of the things that outside of the work that you need to do, maybe there's other opportunities that you hadn't thought of, and this would actually provide a nice way to get that done. So.
Right. So today we're going to start at the dashboard. Otherwise, if you're anywhere in Ready API, you can do File, New, Virtual API, and we are going to use our easily accessible wizards to easier create the API, right? So if you already have something, like if you have, some WSDL, some Swagger definition, this is a very straightforward way for us to ingest it, build an API, whether it's REST from Swagger, SOAP from WSDL. We'll show some like this in a few, but this is a very, very, very common scenario we see where you can record traffic against an existing API. And then I'll show you, once you record it, you can sort of turn off the recording, change it to a negative test, change it to an extreme value, change the format, have full control over it. If the real thing goes down, you have this kind of cloned copy of a Virt or a mock accessible to you for your purposes, for your ecosystem of driving your applications through these APIs. So there's a couple of ways to record traffic. There is one very common way where we can stand up a proxy. You tinker with network settings, change it to go through our proxy at a whole network layer. We have that option. That's not the optimal one in my experience, right? What I find a lot more usable is using our Virt as a router, as a sort of proxy itself, so that you don't have to capture all your network traffic that sends calls to Google Analytics and different health status panes, right? But you'd basically set up this Virt and then point it to the real thing so we can actively learn from the real thing, if you will. So in my example, I am going to use Google Maps Live API, and my first call is going to be looking up information regarding to Boston. And the wizard, again, kind of auto sets up a lot of it for us. Excuse me. So I am going to, instead of creating a new project, I'm going to add it to a virtualization sample project, and we'll hit finish. So at this point, here's what happened. We transitioned back over to ServiceV. We added a brand new REST Virt 1, which is going to route traffic to the real thing. And this REST Virt 1 is now running on my machine, right, on port 8080. So I had that port open. I didn't have a port conflict, so we stood up a Virt. And this Virt has no knowledge. It's completely blank. There's nothing that it can learn from. So here's my scribble of nothing.
It's pretty blank.
Yeah, there's nothing. There's no knowledge. But it's kind of auto-configured to say, if you don't know how to handle something, route to Google Maps. So this is our pointer as a reference to the real thing, right? And again, I'm pointing to a public third-party API. So you could point to any third-party API you have access to. You can point it to other internal APIs that other team may not be finished developing yet, right? So anything you literally have access to that changes, that transforms, that goes down all the time, this is a good use case to apply where you can record that traffic. From there, you can generate traffic against this Virt. Okay, and again, you could generate traffic using SOAP UI. You could generate traffic using your client, your application. So, for example, in this example, say if I have my application that uses Google Maps data, I then change my application to point to localhost instead, and the traffic will route through to Google Maps. In this scenario, in this example, I just want to show this to you using the browser. So we'll kick off the browser, and here's the browser. Now, there is some caching issues within the browser, so I may have to refresh it once or twice, right? But here you can see when I make a call to local API with a reference to this resource, this query string, behind the scenes, the transaction log actually went to Google Maps, and we received the response from Google Maps, right? So here's my query for Boston, gives me my, county, state, everything related to Boston that we found back as a response. And we were able to learn the setup that when you do a get for this resource and you're looking for an address query of Boston, this is your response. Okay? From there, we can actually do a number of different searches. So let's go to the other coast. Let's look up LA. And again, sometimes I'm getting cached values. I need to start looking up different areas, right? And then from there, let's look up some bad data that shouldn't have an address associated with that, right? So this is our zero results data. So from these interactions, we now build out 3 different responses from a real API. We find Boston, LA, and
Junk,
nothing, 0 results, right? Let's actually, we'll rename it as such. But at this point, I say we're done. We only have so much time. We have other scenarios to get to, so we'll say turn off routing. Now we're going to, when we make the same call, return one of the corresponding responses. So here you can look at the responses. I definitely suggest renaming them. So this is our no results, right? You can reconfigure it. So right now we are matching in the parameters, but you can say by default, go to no results. Okay, so now again, this is now virtualized. Oh, and by the way, when we found area for response for Boston, let's put in SmartBear. Let's modify it. So this is going to be SmartBear Academy, right? So we captured it, we modified it. At this point, you can change the values, you can make them, edge cases, different formats, different status codes, different content. You can add additional responses, do some additional rules, right? But the real traffic helped a lot of this setup. So I didn't have to type this out originally, right? I just looked at the traffic, recorded it, turned off the recorder. So now that I turned off the recorder, if I look up, say, Chicago, right? This will give me junk response by default. That's what we configured. And if I go back and look at Boston, and again, there's a caching thing going on with the browser, right? If I refresh it, this is going to give me a modified response that has our reference of SmartBear Academy. So now I don't have to work with Google and say, add SmartBear Academy in there. They would never do that. But I wanted to show you that I have full control of this response, and in my local environment, I can put in whatever I want, right? Edge cases, negative scenarios. I don't have to break their application. I can just put in a 500 response code and start handling that. And then the exciting part that, I think is excellent, right? So here's Boston with SmartBear Academy. I know.
Exciting part.
I know I get excited about these weird things, but this I wish I had this before, Gail. So, but this is a good example where, this will consistently give us back a mock response with a value, but I can still look up Boston for a different format, like XML, and this will work against the real thing, right? So because we're routing against because we're routing against XML, and we're kind of mocking against JSON, right? We now have that granular control. So going back to that Chicago example, right? We can get XML Chicago value, right? We would still serve back no results in the JSON part. So we have that granular control over, mocking parts of an operation or even mocking new operations that haven't been created yet. So that was a fairly common scenario, the first scenario about creating APIs by recording real responses. And again, use that for, I've used that against the REST API with JSON, but if you went to do that against, I've seen that done against websites, XML, OData, all sorts of traffic types.
Yep. Cool. All right, that's great. I love the recording. Recording just is so cool.
I know.
When before I started working in virtualization, I was like, that's so slick.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the second scenario is where we're reducing time to market. And basically, another reason that people virtualize is because teams are actually building APIs and you want to start testing them before they're available, or you're in a very, you're working towards a DevOps or, a continuous integration model, more agile or whatever, where you need to shorten those times between creation and testing. So you have to be able to do them sort of in parallel. So we see a lot of needs around that for virtualization, as well as location issues. So if you had teams that are in different locations, they're, let's say, not a crazy scenario. You have a team that's in India and you have another team that's in the US, you can actually give people access even when there isn't access, on a normal network and stuff like that. So either one of those would be great reasons to talk about virtualization. And in this one, so currently being developed in this scenario, the testing teams are able to test the APIs that aren't finished yet, and the developer would create the virtualized instance of the API. So the developer now creates that virtualized instance because they know what it's supposed to do. They're working on the design of it. They might have created a WSDL. They might be using Swagger for the definition. And so you use that definition now to just create this virtualized instance of it. And now the test team can go ahead and get started, either creating tests or executing tests against that. So it's a great way to circumvent the system and reduce those dependencies.
That's what we're all about.
Exactly.
So this is definitely an exciting one, and I'm thinking, and there's actually a couple of questions in the questions tab that address this exactly, right? So creating a Virt from an existing definition, right? So I'm still going to focus on REST. It's very easy to do from SOAP as well, but there was a question specific to Swagger, so that's what I'll show. There was also a question about how does this get controlled for response purposes, for load testing purposes. So we do have easy configurable areas for that within ServiceV, within the behavior tab, so I will show you that. And we'll also show some transaction log as well so that you can understand kind of what's going on behind the scenes of this virtualized API. So, and now that I think about it, I'll show you two ways about creating real APIs. So, sorry, creating virtual APIs from Swagger, from some interaction. So you can also create a new API, right? So we're going to use that virtual API wizard that I've shown you before when we recorded traffic. You can also do it from a description file. So this is where WSDL, Swagger, other definitions come in. I am going to use a public pet store Swagger API that has a bunch of different functions and methods around pet store, right? And all the things related to pet. So we can just ingest that JSON. We're going to also create that in our virtualization sample project, and we're going to run the Virt, and then I'll show you sort of how to access and modify it. So in this case, because we were able to understand this kind of pet store action, we can match all the different methods, right? So if you're doing a post, if you're doing, you know, get, if you're supplying a pet ID in this get call, we can definitely kind of look up exactly what's going on. So, and behind the scenes, we also have kind of control over what responses are matched here. So let's find that get pet ID, right? So in this case, we have a number of responses. So here's a response that we were able to, you know, when you're looking up a pet ID, build out from Swagger definition. So again, all we did was ingest Swagger, build out this kind of name, not name value, this pair of pairing of matching the request against the method and the resource, and serving back a response. I'm going to change this to a parameter just to default it to response 2 that has the value in here, right? So whenever we're looking at pet ID, right now by default we're going to find this very specific pet ID, and we're going to create, say, pet ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and name SB Academy Pet. Okay, so again, all we did was ingest Swagger. This is now up and running on localhost 8088, and we modified a response based on that Swagger definition. I can kind of show you here how this works. So we can do a get pet ID and get this response. I can also show you how, you know, this would work against a different client. So again, I'm going to use my browser as a client. So we're going to go against localhost 8080 slash v2 pet, and then any ID, right? 1, 2, 3. That should match against the pet ID. I had the wrong port. Always user error whenever I don't see a response. There we go. So, you know, we were able to find this pet ID. Whenever stuff, you know, whenever there's other kind of transactions, other things going on, in the transaction log, you can see what's been accessed, how it's been accessed, right? So if we're sending in direct pet ID, or if we're sending in 1, 2, 3, right, you can see all the different requests that went against it. You can see what responses were sent back. And here in the behavior tab, this is where we can add in, you know, if you're doing massive load against this, you can restrict, limit it. You can limit this virtualized connection to an API. You can kind of introduce congestion, cap your max threads that are processed. But most often I see people introduce latency, right? So let's make this wait for 2.5 seconds before we get a response. So now that same call, you can see, is going to spin for about 2.5 seconds before we get a response, right? So again, this is a way for you to introduce latency to a Virt, and then when you access this virtual API, because the client will not even know it's a virtual API. So when you access it from SOAP UI, when you access it from your client, right, you can control latency and other behavior. One other really quick thing I wanted to show you, really quick thing. So if you import your endpoints, WSDLs, etc. here, right? This is another way. So say if you add a pet here, right? So let's add a real pet.
A real pet?
Yeah. Well,
a real virtual.
This is all virtual, real virtual pet. This is.
Is there
let's
a
add
little puppy over there?
Pet rock. Okay. We'll add a real pet rock. So here's our pet rock over here. Another thing you could do is you can always right-click. So again, this is from a projects tab, right? And you can add it to a REST Virt through this right-click action. And you can either add it to an existing Virt or create a brand new one, right? So this is definitely another way for everyone who's on is familiar with SOAP UI, right? So this is another way for them to kind of go from existing API calls to virtualized ones, and this will work for SOAP, for REST, and for other calls as well. So this is how you would create. This is how you would create a Virt from an existing definition, whether it's on the project side of SOAP UI, whether it's some public Swagger or public or WSDL that you have. I pointed to a hosted one, but if you have a file, you can just point to a file, right? So it doesn't even have to be hosted, and then you can stand it up, virtualize it, control it, and then start your integration without, I don't know, getting VPN access or hassling developers to give you some kind of access to a dev environment that might not even be consistent.
Hey, so I see an edit that needs to be made on this slide. Do you see it? It's missing Swagger.
Yeah.
Big.
That's true.
Big.
That's true.
Miss.
Sorry, I was thinking back in my Canadian days. I'm like, behavior needs a U? Maybe.
Maybe. I don't know that. Okay, so so the last scenario that we're going to cover, actually, it was great, Mike showing all that stuff, and it was actually quite timely since we had a question about it. So it fit in perfectly. They were ahead of us, basically. And so the last scenario we're going to do is the API. One of the other reasons that people virtualize APIs or virtualize services is to control the conditions, the responses that we get back. So in a lot of scenarios, people have lots of data, and this allows you to drive responses with lots of data versus having to use a real full test bed. So we might have a customer database that has 20,000 users in it, and do you really need the customer database of 20,000 users, or could you use something else, a smaller subset of that? There's also a reason is to simulate responses that have multiple steps to prepare the data. And one of the things that we often talk to our customers about is, how much do I virtualize, or where do I virtualize? And oftentimes, what we recommend is that you virtualize the beginning of the part that you don't necessarily care about, where the part that you're not trying to test, the part that you're not that you can't depend on. So if that part has multiple APIs that it calls, just you're boiling it up, and you're just doing the request and response at that entry point, and you don't care about the downstream APIs that might be called. So we don't think that you need to virtualize all of the APIs within a workflow, only the ones that are at the entry point to what you want, that you have dependencies on.
Right.
So
yeah, and I mean, those could be internal, provided by the teams that they're owning, external, provided by other companies that other companies are owning, right? But now we see that APIs depend on APIs, front-end depend on APIs, right? Mobile depend on APIs. So if you have an API that you own, by all means, this will not replace it, but you'll see other dependencies where, it's just your whole architecture has so many dependencies where I'm sure this will be a fit in a few places.
The other thing I just want to mention, right, since we're talking about it, is that what we see is there's so many consolidation of companies where there's a merger, and now this other company is part of your company. You have to start to integrate their products and things like that.
And they're doing a transition from mainframe to
Yeah,
APIs
exactly.
through Enterprise Service Bus.
Yeah, so that when we say there's external APIs, they could be external to your control.
Right.
So it could be inside your company, but they're still external to what you have control over. So, and the other thing that just to the controlling conditions is really simulating bad conditions. And we always joke sort of like, going back to the dev team and saying, excuse me, would you do me a favor and break the environment so that I can test how it responds when the network doesn't come back, or or when there's something really awful that happens. So to really do thorough testing, there's conditions that you can't simulate, that you can't create easily, you can't generate easily, and so you would be able to simulate those environments, those scenarios, using virtualization rather than trying to I think do handstands in your environment to make it happen.
Well, my favorite use case is when you actually, say you integrate against a third-party API, you actually do break it, and that's your condition,
right.
And then that triggers like an alarm in their logs, and then they spend so many resources and come at you for you shouldn't do that, and it's like, well, you should have a solid API, right?
Exactly. So with that,
so again, think about these use cases applied to different scenarios, because what we said can still apply to recording, modifying what you recorded. And in this one is more kind of to prototype something that maybe someone else is developing, right? So maybe they are in that state of transition from mainframe to APIs or creating new APIs, and you can't just wait for them to give you a real thing, because you need lead time, you have your own deliverables, timelines, right? And by then you can't just have your team sit and just wait for something to be provided to start writing integrations. So one thing you can do is very, very easily create prototypes while others are creating real APIs. So in this case, we're going to go back to our wizard to create a virtual API. And we're going to use the last option that we haven't used yet. We've already recorded traffic against an existing API. We already imported some pre-built description file, right, that someone either created, built out, something. But in this case, there's nothing. So we're just going to create APIs from the top of our head. So we're going to do this against a couple of different methods and resources. So we're going to do a post for create. So this is going to be our create method, and you can see I can just type it out. This did not exist. There's no Swagger defined out of this, or there's no kind of reference for it. We can do a put, which is going to be an update action, and we can do a get for, let's say, find by ID. Right. So here we are expecting something excuse me, to be passed through as an ID. So very easily, very quickly, we can create this. Let's put this back in our virtualization sample project, and we're going to run this Virt. So again, we have this window that allows us to make these calls. So we'll kind of keep it aside, but we're going to go back and further modify the responses. So when you do a create, let's say that a user is created, right? So here we're going to say created, or let's say status created. Okay. Same idea when we do an update, we're going to have a response with status updated for JSON. And then here is where it gets much more interesting. So when we do a get find by ID, we can do status not found. And we can have a status code of let's say, I don't know.
Go crazy.
Yeah, 500. Okay. Going crazy here.
Yeah.
Love it. So this can be our not found, right? And then in some case we can have a found response where we have an element with, you know, ID of something, and we can make this dynamic. I might even actually show this, but right now we'll do ID 1 to 3, right? So right now, by default, we created this, right? So we can get created, updated, not found, then not found again, then found again, and so on it goes, right? Let's have a little more control. Let's bring back our browser for the client, right? So this is now hosted on a different port of 8089. We're going to find something with 1 to 3, right? So again, this is going to kind of rotate through what we serve back. And if there's multiple people accessing this API, then we have no visibility and no control over what comes back. So we can actually control different dispatch styles. So when you make an access to find something by ID, we can do different things. We can randomize it, which doesn't really help you control anymore, right, than the sequence. If you have XML payload, which you do if you have SOAP APIs, and which, you know, is getting to be somewhat common in REST APIs, you can use query match or XPath. If you're proficient with Groovy scripting, you can do anything. You can access headers, payload, anything. You can make background calls to Active Directory and find related information, do a subquery, and you can get crazy. Not just the status code 500 crazy. You can get really crazy. But we won't quite get that crazy. We're just going to write a condition for a parameter, right? So we can say, by default, nothing is found. But we're going to add a condition where in the path, we're looking for an ID element, right? So that's this ID over here, this bracket encapsulated ID, which could be dynamic, could be 1 to 3, could be, I don't know, skew something, could be whatever you want. And we can say, again, this is ours to control, so we can say if there's a reference within the ID that contains a string item, then give it a found response. Okay? So now we actually added control to it. So right now, whatever number I look for, right? So I can put in whatever number I want. We're not going to find it. But if I put in a reference to item anywhere before, after, in the middle, any item reference, so because this item contains string within that ID, that will give us a valid ID that is found, right? So this is a way for us to control different conditions and control which responses can be found, right? So I've given you kind of a path where within the rule editor you can match. For REST APIs, you can match on query parameters, on path, on HTTP headers, right? Using Groovy, you can do anything. You can do conditional payload match where, you know, these two elements sum to, I don't know, length greater than 20, then this. And then you can return, you know, different responses. I want to show you one other thing that'll take 2 minutes, is the data sources. So this is another way where now we can find something, right, with an ID, but it's a static ID. It's always going to find item 1 to 3. So using a data source, you can actually literally connect to any source of data. Most often it's an Excel or a database. I personally, for virtual APIs that contain dummy data, I really like the data gen part of it. So here we can add any property, let's say ID, right? And here we can say this is going to be, let's say, a custom string with number, character, followed by an integer that is 4 characters long. So it's between 1000 and 9999, right? So this is going to give us a sample random value. And then in the found response, we can make that link to a data source we just configured. And instead of using this hard-coded value, oops, so this needs to be within, we can just, again, right-click and add a reference to a data source property of ID we just created. So from this, we can now not only find an ID of 1 to 3, but random number to make it appear a little more lifelike, right? So that when you expose this to people, it looks good enough, right? So in this case, again, we have control over this. I can add a delete action. I can give you, delete it successfully, delete it unsuccessfully. And again, if you need to kick off delete 100 times to, maybe make sure that that rolls something back in the inventory, this is a good use case where you can virtualize it and you don't have to see the value to delete it. You can just, mimic a delete. But this is definitely a way for you to not only, we've gone over create APIs from scratch, add different responses, and control them. One last thing, I'm going to take some liberty, and I want to show you one additional last thing.
Ooh.
And this is
Wild.
Hey, when I show this to the right audience, they actually get crazy.
I hope we can tell from the chat box.
So we created an empty Virt that had this bunch of actions that had create, update, find by ID. I created this. Let's say I want to develop it, right? So this works. I run this by Gail. Gail says, yeah, looks good. Go build it. A quick thing that I can do is if I access api-docs.json, guess what this is? This is a Swagger definition for what we just created. So using Swagger, I'm using Swagger Hub that kind of, puts everything together. I can literally paste in whatever was just created, whatever was generated by this thing, right? I can fill this in. I can generate documentation for create, find ID, etc. And I can generate server stubs so that I don't even have to start coding from scratch. I can just generate, say, my Java JAX-RS library, and then I can fill in and hook this up to logic. So this makes the whole, path of prototyping within Ready API help you skip a few steps when you take it out into the real world to actually, access Swagger that's generated behind the scenes, bring that into Swagger tools, and then generate code from that. So if you like that, let me know if you're interested in more information in the questions tab, and we'll follow up.
That's great. All right, so let's go back to the slides. So this is a really big list, and I debated taking it out, but a couple things that I wanted to sort of bring up about the stuff that Mike was showing you. And we've added a lot of functionality, and we talked about JDBC, virtualization, so you can virtualize databases. We have added virtual service management capabilities in the dashboard, and the dashboard was something that we added in 2.0, and it gives you ability to control the virtual services that you created really quickly, easily, see what ports, see what's running, what ports are running on, things like that. We've added a lot of performance enhancements and ease of use enhancements around the routing and recording and the transaction logging. We also added this ability to maintain the query parameters, which Mike actually showed you, but when you're moving a Virt from the server to a project. So we'll show you more about the interaction with Virt server in the next session. We can now duplicate Virt responses, and actually that's one of the ways that we build up JDBC Virts, is that you can record your JDBC interaction, and then you can duplicate it and then edit it to create different responses. We had a wizard, and that's actually one of the things I wanted to sort of mention again is that when people are getting started with any of our products, whether it's SOAP or Load or ServiceV, we have a wizard capability that's built right into the product right now, and it's right in the dashboard. It's also available from the file menu, and it's a really quick way to get started on creating whatever test you want to create. And we've actually shown it to lots of new users, and they love it because it walks them through it. So instead of starting with that big palette of you can do anything, it takes you through the steps and you generate whatever kind of test you want, or Virt or load test, really quickly and easily, and then you can go ahead and start, move on from there. But it's a really great way to get started. We've added the conditional routing, which Mike talked about. We have tags now because we have customers with hundreds of Virts. Allows them to sort them and filter them and organize them in a better way. We've added a graphical UI for managing the Virt server, which we'll show you in the next session. So there's been a lot of focus on virtualization. We'd also have Maven and Jenkins integration on both the Virt server as well as ServiceV, so you can do a lot of automation with these tools as well. So, and the reason I want to tell you that is that if you looked at this in the past, you should look at it again. There's a lot of great things you can do with it, and the other reason is that there's so much more that makes it so much easier to use. And as you think about how you can use virtualization in your environment, you shouldn't be limited by, is it hard to get started? Is it hard to use it? Is it hard to configure it? It's really, really easy, and all the tools that you need are there.
That was the screenshot for the web UI, so this one will cover the 202 training.
Exactly. We'll cover this in the next session. And so just in summary, we went through the 3 use cases. Reducing external costs, and Mike showed you how to record an external API and use that to drive the development of the virtualized service. Removing dependencies, Mike showed you how to create the Virt using a definition. So a definition that already exists, whether it's a Swagger definition or a Zilla wallet, right? Exactly. And then the last case we showed you when you want to control the conditions, we showed you how to create a Virt from scratch, like just basically defining those requests and responses, and how you can use data-driven tests and data-driven responses and stuff like that. So we use these use cases to show you the different types of ways that you can create virtualized services. The next session, like we talked about a couple times already, is all about the Virt server and how you can set up and configure it, and Virt actions and what they mean, and how they're different from a Virt, and how their actions are different in a Virt versus in a test. Tips and tricks, and then we actually ask you to come with your questions because we want to be able to respond to your particular needs. So please come with requests for us to talk a little bit more about this, that, or the other thing, and we'll be happy to go through it through the Q&A sessions. So I think we're responding to a lot of the questions that came up. I'm looking to see if there was anything that was consistent. We talked about the Swagger stuff and how you can set up Swagger. Somebody asked about availability of a Virt on the Virt server, and you can have the Virt running only when needed, or you can have it running all the time. It doesn't matter. It's how you set it up. The Virt server is highly scalable, so if you have Virts that you need to have running all the time, that's certainly one of the scenarios.
Yeah, and for people with that concern, I definitely recommend the 202 sessions, because you'll see Virt server. You might think of it as just a server, but it really is orchestration of all the Virts in your environment for different modules, application versions, subsets of different rollouts and deployment schemes, right? So there's an automation component to it. There's a sharing of Virts component to it. So there's more to the 202 session. So far, in this session, we really focused on Virt creation. But as you know, with APIs and microservices, that's the whole point. You're supposed to have a lot of them. So Virt server will help you orchestrate all of them for your particular needs.
So the question is, if you don't have ServiceV Pro, can you? Yes. So the idea with, I think this is the question. The idea with Virt server and ServiceV is that the people who are creating the Virts would be using ServiceV to create the Virts. Lots of users can access the Virt server without having ServiceV. So they could be running tests or creating apps and just leveraging the Virts that were created by other members of the team, and they're running on the Virt server. So yes, you don't have to have ServiceV to access the Virts And the other question was, can you? The other part of that is, can you access Virts on other machines? Yes, you can access it as long as you have Virt server running.
Right. Yeah, and then ServiceV kind of, definitely want to be transparent that if you host a Virt on ServiceV, you've seen me interact with it through localhost, and that's the intended purpose. It's for me, for my local machine, local host. Gail, Dana, they're all on the same network. They're all, wired in. They can't access my machine. They will get a 403. That's by design.
Yep.
So again, in the next session, we'll talk about how to deploy. It's an easy drag and drop or a command line call to a Virt server. The same Virt, when hosted on Virt server, can be accessed by anybody, right? By Dana, by Gail, by other machines and environments that might need to invoke it. Literally anyone.
All right. Well, I think we're actually at the top of the hour.
Yes.
So perfect
Right.
timing.
Right
And,
at 11 o'clock. Perfect.
yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for spending the time. Thank you for all the questions. It helps us to focus what we're showing you, and we look forward to seeing you on the 202 session. Enjoy the rest of the summer.
Thanks.
Here in the U.S. anyway.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Gail. And yes, we'll be back later this month, and then as well, hopefully, be able to see some of you face to face next month in September at the SmartBear Connect conference. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going.